Back in 1914, Rimouski was a village of 3,500 people. And already the sinking of the Empress and the rescue operations conducted from Rimouski, May 29, 1914, had impacted that little town a lot. You have to imagine all the resources that had to be brought together to give food and clothes, just comfort to these 400 survivors that ended up in such a small French-Canadian town.
Welcome to another episode of Fascinated by Shipwrecks. Today, I'm excited to have with me David Saint-Pierre, who is a historian, and he's done a lot of work on the Empress of Ireland.
First of all, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be part of this podcast. I do have a family background related to maritime trades and the River St. Lawrence in particular. I was born on the Gaspé coast near the River St. Lawrence, and I grew up in Rimouski. So it's pretty much a lure to the ocean and to the Maritimes. All my background and all the stories that I heard when I was a kid were about this great grand uncle who was a lighthouse keeper, this other one who had a shipyard, and my great grandfather built ships and was a captain of a schooner that brought goods from Montreal and Quebec to the isolated villages along the St. Lawrence River. And my great uncles were all captains. So I grew up with all these sorts of stories. So, of course, I was fascinated by the sea and ships ever since I was a little kid. In 1985, the wreck of the Titanic was discovered, and the passion just exploded, and I became absolutely fascinated with shipwrecks and ocean liners. And it didn't take very long for me to realize, well, I have one in my backyard. A very famous shipwreck is right off Rimouski, just a few kilometers away out in the river, and that's the Empress of Ireland. I was fascinated with everything related to the Empress of Ireland since the early 1990s. I was still quite young, just starting out studies in history, and I became a tour guide at the Empress of Ireland Museum in Rimouski, near the Father Point lighthouse. And that's how it all really started.
Wow. So you were obviously destined to go down this path.
I think I was, yeah.
Is there anything you don't know about the ship?
Absolutely. Of course. Of course, there's still so much to learn. And that's really what keeps me going, is that it's never ending. And it's an absolutely fascinating field of research. And I still learn every day about the Empress of Ireland. I'm involved in historical research about the Empress ever since that first job at the museum in the 1990s. From a tour guide, I became sort of a historical consultant for a few years, and I just basically never left. So I've been associated with the whole historical research and historical side of that museum since 1996. So it's been 28 years now. The thing that really got me hooked was that even though there had been some books and some really good ones written, even in the 1970s and 80s, documentaries were made about the Empress. Of course, the shipwreck is often called the Forgotten Empress. But the thing that got me really hooked was that I realized at some point that even though there were good books and good research, nobody had ever applying the historical methods, the real academical historical methods to research into that subject. So even though it was this large shipwreck that caused more than 1,000 victims, nobody had, I don't know why exactly, but it had been left to amateur historians, and nobody had ever taken the path of really applying historical methods and archival research to that particular subject. That's basically the only thing that really got me into seriously researching the Empress, I wanted to try that out and actually go to the archival depots and get the sources out and apply critical research and critical methods to these archives. And the result was a collaboration with authors since the 1990s on their own books on the Empress, collaboration on many documentaries, and my own books in the last few years.
So maybe you can give us a nutshell of the events that took place just ahead of that ship sinking. So
Yeah.
give us the era, the time, what navigation was like back then, and how the strategy unfolded.
The Empress of Ireland had a sister ship, the Empress of Britain. And these two ocean liners were launched in 1905 and 1906 and started out their liaison between Liverpool and Quebec City in 1906. So they were the largest and fastest ocean liners on the Canadian route at the time. And they did crossings every year to Quebec City during the navigation season on the St. Lawrence River, because in the winter they had to go to St. John, New Brunswick and Halifax starting in 1913. But everything was pretty much uneventful, and they remained the most popular and most celebrated steamships on the Canadian route up until 1914. And May 28, 1914, the Empress of Ireland was leaving Quebec City for Liverpool for the first crossing from Quebec for that season, for the summer season. So she had to leave Quebec City with a pilot on board. And Father Point near Rimouski, where there's a big, tall, white lighthouse, was the pilot station at the time. So the Empress had to leave Quebec City with 1,477 people on board for this crossing and drop a pilot off at Father Point and then just sail down the St. Lawrence River towards the Gulf and the ocean. Canadian Pacific Railway at the time, owners of the ship, made a lot of advertisement saying only 4 days at sea or only 4 days in open sea, because the St. Lawrence River, being sheltered waters, was seen as more safe, which is ironic when in the end we know that the ship actually sank in the sheltered waters of the St. Lawrence River. So the Empress of Ireland dropped down her pilot in Father Point at around 1:45 a.m. In the morning. She sailed out of Father Point towards the Gulf, but pretty soon another ship was sighted in the vicinity. And you have to know that in May, even late May like that, water is still pretty cold. It's always cold in the St. Lawrence. But the day had been quite warm, and this spring of 1914 had been really dry with even forest fires early in the season. And so this is the sort of conditions that create a lot of fog banks. So the Empress had encountered fog a couple of times already, sailing down from Quebec City that night. But very unfortunately, one big fog bank came in between the Empress and that other ship that had just been sighted off of Saint-Luc-sur-Mer on the St. Lawrence. The two ships signaled each other their directions and what they intended to do with foghorns, but signals were either misinterpreted or wrongly heard. The two ships were crossing each other's paths really close to one another in approach of the pilot station. And unfortunately, at around 2 a.m. in the morning, the Storstad, the freighter that had been sighted at about 8 miles from the Empress, crashed into the starboard side of the Empress of Ireland violently and got out of the breach that she had just made in the side of the hull of the Empress. The two ships separated again in fog, and the Empress sank in 14 minutes. So, of course, with 1,057 passengers on board at 2 a.m. Pretty much everybody was asleep. A ship as large as that, I often say that it's comparable to a more than 400 room hotel. First night on board, sinking in only 14 minutes. There was not much chance for the passengers down below to survive. Unfortunately, 840 passengers died on the Empress of Ireland. And that's more than on the Titanic. It's not more people that died on the Empress, but more passengers, more paying passengers. Because the crew was, a great number of them were on watch, they were on duty, and they knew their ways around the ship. They knew how to figure out that when the siren was blown, it meant that this was the muster call for emergency, and they had to go to the lifeboats and close the watertight doors, and all these sorts of stuff that are not well known by the passengers. There was no lifeboat drill for passengers that day, so first night on board, they didn't know their way around. How do you get out of your cabin and go all the way up to the boat deck, to a lifeboat, and in the dark when the ship is listing in 14 minutes? It was almost impossible. So almost 60% of the crew members survived, but more than 60% of the passengers on board died, unfortunately.
It's quite a haunting tragedy. So in the intervening years afterwards, there were changes to regulations. Maybe you can speak to that a little.
One thing I have to say on that first, I think it's relevant also, is that the regulations had already been changed after the Titanic disaster. Mm-hmm. And it, of course, did not prevent this one. For example, the Empress of Ireland sailed for 6 years without enough space in her lifeboats for everybody on board, just like almost all the liners on the North Atlantic up to the Titanic disaster. After the Titanic disaster, lifeboats were added. Collapsible Engelhart model lifeboats were added on the Empress, and she had plenty of places on her lifeboats to save everybody on board. But of course, when the ship is listing and sinking so fast, it's almost impossible to launch any lifeboats. And as a matter of fact, in this case, we know that only about 4 or 5 lifeboats were actually filled with people and launched. And the rest of the lifeboats that were used were, for most part, used because they detached themselves when the ship sank, and people fell in the water and then used the lifeboats. One of the things that was changed after the Titanic disaster and did not prevent this disaster was that the wireless shack on the Empress of Ireland, the Marconi wireless shack, was moved from aft on the ship towards a boat deck near the officers' quarters. So the communications between the officers and the wireless operator would be quicker. And they did, on the Empress of Ireland, have time to send an SOS to Father Point, which sent 2 ships to the rescue. The Eureka, the pilot boat, and the Lady Evelyn, the mail tender at Rimouski. But they arrived too late and they couldn't do much. So yes, regulations were changed, and even the rules of the road eventually on the St. Lawrence River were changed because the pilot station was changed from the South Shore to the North Shore, but it took decades to do that. There was no guarantee that any of these changes would actually prevent a disaster like this one because of the very short time that the ship took to founder, which is really the worst part of all this disaster. I mean, 14 minutes is really a short span of time to try and save people on board a ship like this.
Undoubtedly. Maybe you can talk a little bit now about how you came across all of these photos that depict some of the salvage operations. That part of the story I don't think a lot of people know about.
Even I had not been given that much time to research on that part of the story before I found these photos. And very quickly after the sinking, it was decided to try salvaging the wreck. by the CPR, by the insurance companies, and even the Canadian government wanted to recover the mail bags that were on board this ship. This was the RMS Empress of Ireland Royal Mail Ship. So the mail matters on board the Empress were really important to the postal services and the Canadian government. And I had an interest in that part of the story, the salvage operations, before I found these photos. But in the fall of 2021, a friend of mine sent me a link to an online auction for two photos that were misidentified. They were identified as Gaspé Coast circa 1908. And the photos were showing people on the wharf in Father Point with the Father Point lighthouse in the background. And my friend told me, well, I think this is up your turf. I think you'd be interested in these photos. He knew I was especially interested in the history of Father Point Lighthouse, the area, but especially through images. My first book is called Empress of Ireland, une histoire par l'image, so a history through images. I've always been fascinated with photos as sources of historical knowledge. I went to that auction site, saw the two photos, and recognized the scene immediately. This was no Gaspé 1908. This was the salvage operations being prepared in Father Point in the summer of 1914. So, long story short, I contacted the seller of these two photos and asked the seller if they had more of these photos. And she replied immediately, oh, of course I do. I just detached those from an album and I have the whole album. And I purchased the whole album. And she said, there's more than 500 photos of boats, divers, and ships in that album. Are you interested? I said, of course, please stop destroying the album and can we agree on a price for the whole thing? And that's what I did. And among these 500 photos, almost 60, I think it's 56 in total, depict the salvage operations. And I discovered a whole new field of research about the Empress that I did not suspect existed. It gave my second book on the Empress, devoted to the salvage operations in the summer of 1914. One of the things that really fascinated me about this was, since I come from Rimouski, I know this area quite well. Back in 1914, Rimouski was a village of 3,500 people. And already the sinking of the Empress and the rescue operations conducted from Rimouski, May 29, 1914, had impacted that little town a lot. You have to imagine all the resources that had to be brought together to give food and clothes, just comfort to these 400 survivors that ended up in Rimouski in such a small French-Canadian town. So this was already the backdrop of all the events of the summer of 1914. And then you bring in this town a team of about 25 guys from New York with high technology diving equipment, all organizing from Rimouski and Father Point, the largest salvage operation up to that date in Canada. And the divers remained in that area. You have to imagine those are hard hat divers with the manual pumps and everything. For 3.5 months, up till mid-September, they worked over the wreck of the Empress, bringing up bodies of the victims, bringing up mail bags that they could reach, bringing up a large purser safe, and salvaging also 251 silver bars that the Empress carried. So one of the things that fascinated me was the impact in that local area of such an operation. The war started in Europe, but in Rimouski, everybody just still talked about the Empress up till the fall of 1914. So this is one of the angles that I wanted to cover in the book. That book came out in French in 2023, but I've adapted and expanded. It's not a new book, but it's a new version, definitely. It's not just a translation. I've added information and a lot of stuff in it, and it will come out on the History Press in May of 2025.
Now that you've had this other sort of area of research with the ship. Where do you see yourself headed? Like, how much more is there or can you even tell how much more there is to learn about?
I think the discovery of the photos was pretty much once in a lifetime, but you never know. I've been fascinated lately with the legal aspects of the Empress story. The last book on the salvage operations is also about the investigations that were conducted after the Empress sinking. There was an inquiry conducted by Lord Mersey, who was also the commissioner for the inquiry about the sinking of the Titanic, the British inquiry. So Lord Mersey was called again, but then this time for the Empress of Ireland. And everybody talks about this inquiry, but it was not the end of the legal procedures because passengers had put out claims to the CPR for their lost property or lost the lives of their relatives. And these claims ended up being a legal battle before Canadian courts that lasted up till almost the 1930s. It lasted more than 10 years in front of the many courts in Canada, privy council, admiralty courts, insurance claims. That's one thing I've been researching a lot these last few months, and it might end up being another book in the coming years.
Yeah, that will be fascinating because that was something I definitely wanted to touch on. Do you have any stories in there about the survivors?
We always say this or that terrible shipwreck made this many victims. And in this case, 1,012 people died on the Empress. So there were 1,012 victims, right? But I think that the survivors were also victims. Most of them were absolutely traumatized by the experience. And we have a lot of testimonies of either crew members or passengers that survived an ordeal like this and that just barely lived through it and that were still having nightmares in their 80s, some 50 years after that event. And I can imagine why. So I think, yeah, we tend to forget that the survivors were also victims. And when you put that into perspective and you add to that the fact that they were pretty much never compensated for anything, it's a hard thing to live through. There were not many social protections in 1914 for events like this. So most of the relief funds, for example, were just spontaneously put together by the mayor of London or the mayor of Montreal, and they tried to compensate and gather money for the victims and the survivors. But it didn't amount to very much for most people. That's one thing that I think is fascinating about this. I'm telling the story, and it reminds me, for example, of one of the survivors of the Empress, Walter Erzingberg, a man from Switzerland. He was a passenger in second class, and very recently we were contacted by a descendant of his who had just found out that he was a survivor of the Empress. She knew her grandfather very well. He lived up until the early 1980s, if I remember correctly, either the late 70s or early 80s. But he never, ever spoke about the Empress, never of his life. And even close members of his family didn't know about this for the most part until he passed away. And this man in particular, he was living in Canada. He was going back on the Empress. He was going back to Switzerland to see a member of his family that was ill. But all his life was in Canada at the time. But he never came back afterwards. He never wanted to be on board a ship again. And so it's these sorts of stories that his life was completely changed, completely transformed by this event. Those are the kinds of stories that I like to follow and put into the perspective of the bigger story. It really is fascinating. And when I was saying in the opening that I learn every day about the Empress and it will never end. Well, these are the sorts of things that get us going into research, and it never ends. We always find new stories.
I would imagine just like the people, finding out the evolution of what happened afterwards and how it affected people, interestingly enough, can also affect the person who is doing this research, right? So you yourself have some emotional, impact when you uncover these details and look farther down the line with research or get contacted, like you were just saying, like there's a whole, it's like that tragedy sort of lives through time and affects people through time.
Absolutely. And I'm a member of the board of directors of the Empress of Ireland Museum in Rimouski. It's the only permanent exhibit on the Empress. It's an exhibit, it's a museum, but we also try to make it a permanent memorial. When we organize every year an activity commemorating the sinking around 29th of May, of course, it's always very emotional and moving, especially when we have either the Salvation Army participating, because there was a large contingent of the Salvation Army of Canada on the Empress that night. A lot of them perished. When we have the Salvation Army participating, or any descendant of a victim or a survivor of the Empress, you 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 get a sense of what it really means. And especially now, I've been participating in these commemorations since the 1990s. So I remember when we were about 80 some years after the sinking, and now we're 110 years after the sinking. Last year we had a big commemoration for the 110th anniversary, and so we have people there that it's not even their parents that were victims or survivors. It's their grandparents. And they're still moved about this story because they know that it completely changed and impacted lives of their ancestors. And it had such a profound impact that as a researcher or an outsider that has no personal connection to the story, you're absolutely right. It does create a bond or an emotion on us. I'm really glad that you're doing something on the Empress of Ireland because it's still called sometimes. That's really one of my pet peeves. It's still called sometimes Canada's Titanic, and I personally I've nothing against the idea of making a publicity around the Empress using the Titanic story that's so well known. But I don't personally like that because the Empress has a story of her own, and I'm really grateful that you're talking about the Empress and that the story gets out there for what it is and not as Canada's Titanic. It's the Empress of Ireland. So thank you for having me and letting me discuss this important ship and this important story with you.
Well, thank you so much for being here because it's been really fascinating. And I look forward to staying in touch. But for now, I will say goodbye and thank you so much again for being with us today, David.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Take care.
In the deep, the answers hide. Echoes of the past call out. Whispers from beneath the waves. What secrets do the shadows keep? Do we dare disturb their sleep? What secrets do the shadows keep?